Hello everyone, Colin Canet here for Woodwork Web. You know, when I get emails and questions and comments on a specific topic, what I read from that is that I haven't explained something well enough and it's generated comments and questions. And today, what I want to talk about is something that I do in almost every project that we do, whether it's furniture or boxes or cabinetry, we put on some kind of a bottom or some kind of a back, and they're all sort of the same thing. So today I'm going to tell you and show you how I was taught to do it, sort of the traditional way, and then I'm going to show you what I do now because I think it might be a little bit easier for some of you. So stick around and let me show you what we do for backs and bottoms. So what I have here, I've just made up with some cut-offs of wood that I had, some scraps. I've just made this little box, and we'll fasten this together later on with some screws after we've done some of the cutting. Now, when it comes to putting backs, if this was a cabinet or if this was a box and you were putting a bottom on it, there's a couple of ways you can do that. First of all, you can put it on top and just tack it on, nail it on, use some air nails, whatever. The second way, of course, is to recess it so that the back is level with the sides. And that's obviously a much more elegant way of doing it, and that's what I want to talk about today. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to cut rabbets all the way around, and you can see from this that this goes inside these two pieces of wood, so I can cut a through rabbet all the way on these two ends, but on these I have to stop and start because we don't want the rabbet to run through. Now on one of these I'm actually going to do that. I'm going to run the rabbet all the way through so you can see what that looks like. But in a cabinet or a box, typically we would want to stop and start there. So let's go over to the table saw and we'll do the first cuts. Here I am at the table saw, and traditionally I was told to cut rabbets on the table saw using a dado blade. In this case, I've just put in my wobble wheel because it's quick and easy. And basically, we want to cut this part out here, and we want to cut that all the way down. Now, I've already installed my blade, I've already set it up, but when you're cutting a rabbet on, remember we showed you how I showed you we need a stop and a start? Well, on the blade here, I've marked where the blade comes out of the table and where it enters back in. So this would be a start and a stop. So what I'm going to be doing, I will mark this right there and right down there, and they're just random marks for right now. And typically what we will do is drop that blade down on that mark onto the blade, run it through, and pick it up. And that will give us a stop and a start rabbet. Now, typically we would do that on both of these pieces of wood, but the second one I'm going to run all the way through so you can see what that looks like, because I've had questions on that. So remember, the two short ones we're going to push all the way through, and the one long side we're also going to push all the way through, and only one of them are we going to do the stop and the start. And while I'm at the table saw, you know, Using small pieces of wood, I always warn people you need to be very, very careful. And that's why I designed this special little push stick. It's got an anti-skid material on it. It's got a big area for me to grab onto. And look at how wide it is. It's about 1.5 inches, 2 inches wide. So it actually traps the material and makes sure that I'm always in control, that I can't fly up or do anything. So you always need to make sure that you work safely, and especially when you've got smaller pieces of wood. There's our little demonstration box, freshly cut off the table saw, and you can see I've highlighted that a little bit there so you can see how that's rounded. Now typically you need to dig this out with a chisel. So you'll chisel down here and chisel down here to make this square in here. And that's pretty normal stuff. And you'll have to do the same thing at this end. Now, here's the end that I cut all the way through. Now, this is really not what you want to do. I know it looks easy. You just put a little piece in here, but you often get glue in places where you really don't want to get glue. It's going to affect the finish. Believe it or not, this is actually a simpler method of doing that, at least in my opinion. Anytime I've tried to do this. The other thing is, if this is a cabinet, depending on where you're looking at this, if this is the top, this could be the top, for example, and this is the side, you don't want to have holes in the side of your cabinet and little pieces of wood at the back. It just doesn't look that good. So next we're going to do what I do now, and that's using the router. Now the next thing I'm going to do with this is assemble this. I'm going to put some screws in all the 4 corners here, because when I use my router, I do it on an assembled carcass. So I'll go ahead and do that off camera. Okay, so I've assembled the little box. I just put some screws in there because we're going to do the next part now, which is rabbeting. In this case, we're going to flip it upside down and do the other side. Now, if you watch me on the table saw, you could see I was a little bit leery. I don't really like using small pieces like this on the table saw. The small ones you can whip through, but when you have to stop and start a dado on the table saw with little pieces, it becomes more of a safety hazard. So I really don't like doing that, and that's why I came up with this other idea. What I'm finding I'm using to cut rabbits now more often than not is a router with something called a rabbeting bit. And let me show you a close-up of what this is. So what I have here is something called a rabbeting bit. And you can remove the cap screw from these and replace it with different size bearings. And of course, when you put a different size bearing on, you get a different depth of cut. So you adjust the cut by the bearing, by putting a different size bearing on, and then adjusting the bit while it's in the router according to the base of the router. So I'm just going to install this now in my router and show you how we cut rabbets with the router. So there's my rabbeting bit in the router, and I've already set the height, and of course the bearing is going to determine the depth of the cut. So I'm just going to plug this in now, and we'll be able to start making that cut. And there's that cut using the router. Basically the same thing, but now what we have now, because it's a router bit, if you look, you can see that there's some we have rounded edges here. So a couple of things you can do with these. You can take these and cut them off with the chisel if you want. Or the other thing, and I'm just experimenting with it now, typically that would go on like that and you would cut that square. But you know what? You can also round over the corners, and depending on the size of your material, you can get a beautiful, nice fit like that. And now all you need to do is tack that on, and you've got a back on there, cut to size and fitted to the corners. So a couple of options. This is what I'm doing now. I'm using the router to do this, and it makes a nice clean cut, and it doesn't matter what the carcass is that I'm using. It always follows that path. Well, the good thing about woodworking is there's often many different ways of accomplishing the same thing. And you know, if you're using hand tools, you could be using something called a rabbeting plane. You may not have a full-size router. You may have what we call a trim router, and you could use a rabbeting bit in here, although it's probably not ideal because there may be a little bit underpowered depending on how deep your cuts are, and if you're using hardwoods, you might burn it out a little bit quicker, but it's something you could certainly try. And you know, the rabbeting bit you could use in a router table as well. You could do the plunge cut, so you plunge in, move it along, and pull it out. Lots of different ways of doing rabbeting cuts. That concludes my video. I'm Colin Cadet for Woodwork Web. Thanks for watching, and make sure that you work safely.